We are here for the penultimate stave in what is this version of The Willows by Algernon Blackwood. Welcome to Strip Cover Lit, where we squeeze the bigger picture out of literature. I'm Adrian Ford, and we are here for another video which will appear in the both the Classic Haunts playlist here on the channel as well as the Willows playlist here on the channel. Read along here, and we have a stave that is largely, I would say, a repeat of the previous sort of chapter in this short story, but it does advance the drama, if nothing else. There are some very extensive quotes that I have for this video, so we have to get it right into it. But there's also, I think, one of the most interesting quirks of human storytelling that is ancient and is perhaps extremely ancient in this portion. So let's get into it. This video will have three different sections: a So What Happened recap of this portion of the story, a literary criticism section where we talk about the literary goings-on, and finally a writer's corner where we talk about the things that we can take from this portion of the story as writers ourselves. So, what happened? Our narrator's friend wakes him with breakfast cooking. The water is still rising. As our narrator is bathing, he realizes that his mate intends to stay until the following day. Was he too scared to leave? What is going on there? He reveals that the steering rudder is gone and there's a tear in the bottom of their canoe. There is sabotage afoot. And the remaining paddle is compromised. So how are they ever going to get out of here? It becomes clear that each is insinuating the other is guilty of said sabotage, but we have a little bit of a disconnect from our speaker. Our speaker never really suggests it outright about his companion, which makes you wonder, is this one of those stories where the individual speaking is guilty, just not telling our audience, right? Just not telling his audience here. They spend the day doing repairs as was needed, and then our narrator naps, and then, while he's making dinner, the Swede calls to him and asks if he hears anything, something strange in the distance. It sounds to our narrator like the humming of a gong in the distance, but not that distant. Our narrator responds to the sound of the stew boiling over, and they find out that the bread is gone as well. Has someone eaten it? Has someone stolen it? Has someone discarded it? After nightfall, the Swede starts talking about the great forces at hand that could squash them like flies. Pillow talk, you know? They talk about not talking about talking until a noise scares them and they nearly abandon camp. But they build one more fire before they sleep. As they are doing so, the Swede tackles our narrator and they collapse in horror at some type of apparition on the other side of the fire that has found them. Our narrator passes out and then he comes to. They turn in for one final night. So, what are the literary goings-on in this short story worth talking about? Well, the number one thing I think that is really passed on in this portion of the story is just this: the overwhelming sense that nothing is permanent. And nothing is permanent, even down to the very land on which they find themselves. Remember, the water is still rising. The island on which they find themselves is still diminishing. So if the land on which we are living is not permanent, what is permanent? Is permanence something that we find steadying? Is permanence something that we find comforting? Is permanence, the idea of permanence, something which is important to the very basis of our psyche? early, very early in our existence as a species, it seems that we turned to religion for this basing factor, for this idea that something is forever. And it seems that we have really run with that as a species. So much so, even in light of the fact that we know better, right? We know that the continents on which we stand, have not always been as they are now. Something that we have run with as a species to the extent that we have to remind ourselves that we are going to die. Memento mori, right? This idea that we have to constantly have present a reminder that this is not forever, that there is going to be an end to what it is that we are experiencing. There will be an end to everything that is currently experiencing. Nothing will be there to remember us. We have to remind ourselves of that. Is that not a sign that as a species we have become just at least a little bit unmoored in our day-to-day traverses? Now, this is an extended quote here, but I want to get to it because I think that it is important. Queer thing, he added, in a hurried sort of voice as though he wanted to say something and get it over. Queer thing, I mean about the otter last night. I had expected something so totally different when he caught me with surprise, and I looked up sharply. Shows how lonely this place is. Otters are awfully shy things. I don't mean that, of course, he interrupted. I mean, do you think it really was an otter? What else in the name of heaven, what else? You know, I saw it before you did, and at first it seemed so much bigger than an otter. The sunset, as you looked upstream, magnified it, or something, I replied. He looked to me absently, a moment, as though his mind were busy with other thoughts. It had such extraordinarily yellow eyes, he went on, half to himself. That was the sun too, I laughed, a trifle boisterously. I suppose you'll wonder next if that fellow in the boat. I suddenly decided not to finish the sentence. He was in the act of listening, turning his head to the wind, and something in the expression of his face made me halt. The subject dropped, and we went on with our caulking. Apparently he had not noticed my unfinished sentence. 5 minutes later, however, he looked at me across the canoe, the smoking pitch in his hand, his face exceedingly grave. I did rather wonder, if you want to know, he said slowly, what that thing in the boat was. I remember thinking at the time it was not a man. The whole business seemed quite suddenly out of the water. I laughed again boisterously in his face, but this time there was impatience, and a strain of anger too in my feeling. Why is he feeling anger here? Does he feel as if he himself has been exposed? Look here now, I cried. This place is quite queer enough without going out of our way to imagine things. That boat was an ordinary boat, and the man in it was an ordinary man, and they were both going down the stream as fast as they could lick. And that otter was an otter. So don't let's play the fool about it. He looked steadily at me with the same grave expression. He was not in the least annoyed. I took courage from his silence, and, for heaven's sake, I went on, don't keep pretending you hear things, because it only gives me the jumps, and there's nothing to hear but the river and this cursed old thundering wind. You fool, he answered in a low, shocked voice, you utter fool. That's just the way all victims talk, as if you didn't understand just as well as I do. He sneered with scorn in his voice and a sort of resignation. The best thing you can do is keep quiet and try to hold your mind as firm as possible. This feeble attempt at self-deception only makes the truth harder when you're forced to meet it. What truth is he talking about there? I think what part of what's going on here is permanence really does seem to be important to us, and if nothing is permanent, are we even sure what is real? Questioning the senses is a sure path to madness. You have that bit where it's understandable, perhaps, that they're questioning the otter. They weren't prepared to see an otter. They weren't prepared for that otter to be there, and so in their minds it looked like a body. They thought it was someone who had been, but was no more. But we've all been there, thinking that we have seen something that we didn't see. Have we all been to the point where we thought that something we definitely saw was perhaps different than it appeared? Those are the entrails to madness, perhaps. And this idea that one of the truly most horrific things that we have in literature, I think Shirley Jackson does it very well in The Haunting of Hill House. I think that Joyce Carol Oates does it very well in Where Are You Going, Where Have You Been? And this is when we are shown something. We're shown something in the text. It's explained to us what it looks like. But then when we get a little bit closer, or when we're rethinking the situation, that thing is explained in a different way. And I think part of the reason that works so well in horror is that it is giving you a visual on something and then questioning your own senses. And this is something that is very, very interesting because if we don't have our senses, what do we have? And if there was a person waving to us in a boat, we might question that person's intent, but we don't question what that person really is. Here we have two individuals who have come to the conclusion that perhaps that person in the other boat was not a person. If it wasn't a person, what was it? Certainly looked like a person, certainly gestured like a person, certainly had wants and desires like a person, certainly had the ability to influence other people the way that people do. And if it wasn't a person, why was it trying to influence these people? Very interesting there, very horrific. This third point here, one, two, three, I think is, oh yeah, right, sorry. I had lost myself in my notes here. This is a quote from the text. When common objects in this way become charged with the suggestion of horror, they stimulate the imagination far more than things of unusual appearance. And these bushes, crowding, huddled about us, assumed for me in the darkness a bizarre grotesquerie of appearance that lent them somehow the aspect of purposeful and living creatures. Their very ordinariness, I felt, masked what was malignant and hostile to us. This is, I think, a very good working definition of cosmic horror. I think that this is one of the things in the text that is sort of planted there that primes us for something different. That's why I have meta written up there. This is almost as if it is cosmic horror on cosmic horror. And very interesting in the text for that to happen. Very good working definition, perhaps, of cosmic horror. A little bit further in the text, we have something that is perhaps as unmooring as the suggestion of impermanence. We get this quote. "Death, you mean?" I stammered, icy with horror at his suggestion. "Worse, by far," he said. "Death, according to one's belief, means either annihilation or release from the limitations of the senses, but it involves no change of character. You don't suddenly alter just because the body's gone. But this means radical alteration, a complete change, a horrible loss of oneself by substitution, far worse than death, and not even annihilation. We happen to have camped in a spot where their region touches ours, where the veil between has worn thin. Horrors. He was using my very own phrase, my actual words, so that they are aware of our being in their neighborhood. This, I think, is also partially prompted by the absence of civilization from our characters here. Our characters have journeyed to a place that is free from civilization. They have journeyed to the wilderness. They have journeyed to the great outdoors, if you will. They have journeyed to a place where there are no others. Is civilization itself foundational to what it is that we have evolved to be? If it is, then taking out that foundation from the individual will completely alter the individual's reality. The individual taken out of civilization, if civilization is part of the individual, means that the individual is suddenly in the without. What would you do if all of a sudden, and this is, maybe this is as foundational, what would you do if all of a sudden you didn't have to eat? You didn't have to eat or drink. Would you spend your time differently? Of course you would. Would you be immediately uncomfortable? Of course you would. Would it force you to re-examine all of the things that you had done in your life up to that point? As trivial as the not needing to eat sounds, I bet it would. All of a sudden you have all of this free time and no desire to eat, no urge to consume. What if the practice of being around other people is as foundational to us as that? This is, I think, the realization for these characters that there is something social or communal about them, and now here they are without it, with only each other. So, just something to think about from this text. And the final talking point from a literary standpoint here is maybe my favorite. So we get this quote from the text. "If we can hold out through the night," he added, "we may get off in the daylight unnoticed, or rather, undiscovered. But you really think a sacrifice would—" That gong-like humming came down very close over our heads as I spoke, but it was my friend's scared face that really stopped my mouth. "Hush," he whispered, holding up his hand. "Do not mention them more than you can help. Do not refer to them by name. To name is to reveal. It is the inevitable clue that our only hope lies in ignoring them, in order that they may ignore us. Even in thought?" He was extraordinarily agitated. "Especially in thought. Our thoughts make spirals in their world. We must keep them out of our minds at all costs, if possible." Where does he suddenly have this expertise on the others as presented in this text? Well, this is something very ancient for our storytelling as humans. And I get this from Wikipedia. In Jewish tradition, so this is basically the Voldemort effect, right? He who shall not be named. This is the Voldemort effect in that if you name something, you're giving it power. Where does that come from? Does that start with Harry Potter? No, it does not. In Jewish tradition, when several children have died in a family, the next that is born has no name given to it, but is referred to as alter or alterka. The view being that the angel of death, not knowing the name of the child, will not be able to seize it. When such a child attains the marriageable age, a new name is given, generally that of one of the patriarchs. When captured by Polyphemus, Homer's Odysseus is careful not to reveal his name. When asked for it, Odysseus tells the giant that his name is Otic, which means nobody. But later, having escaped after blinding Polyphemus, and thinking to himself beyond Polyphemus's power, Odysseus, in an act of hubris that was to cause enormous problems later, boastfully reveals his real name. Now knowing his real name, Polyphemus was able to call down upon Odysseus the revenge of his father, the sea god Poseidon. Many later episodes of the Odyssey depict Odysseus facing the relentless hostility of Poseidon, all of which he could have avoided had he persisted in keeping his real name secret. According to practices in folklore referred to as the law of names, knowledge of a true name allows one to affect another person or being magically. It is stated that knowing someone's or something's true name therefore gives the person who knows the true name power over them. This effect is used in many tales, such as in the German fairy tale of Rumpelstiltskin, and there are wild theories about Rumpelstiltskin, which lead some people to believe that that tale is not just old, but especially ancient, and that it has been passed down through generations where words were only spoken, where there was no writing. So worth looking into. I don't really have the time to go into it now, but within Rumpelstiltskin and all its variants, the girl can free herself from the power of a supernatural helper who demands her child learning its name. And then in a different part of that article on Wikipedia, because I thought that this was something that could really sort of illustrate, the true name of the Egyptian sun god Ra was revealed to Isis through an elaborate trick. This gave Isis complete power over Ra and allowed her to put her son Horus on the throne. So how old is this idea that naming something gives it power, or naming or knowing the name of something takes its power? It could be very, very ancient. The true name of the Egyptian sun god Ra was revealed to Isis through an elaborate trick. The Egyptians are... So some of our oldest still tellable tales come from the Egyptians. I have a video on the channel on Khonsu-Imheb and the Ghost, which is the first ghost story that we can still tell. And for this to be a civilization which gives us the first ghost story we can still tell, tells you how old these ideas are, how old Egypt is, and the storytelling, how ancient that is. And the idea that even in Egypt, even with Ra, the sun god, the god of gods basically, this was a tale for that religion. How old is this idea? Ra would have probably... I mean, we don't really know the evolution of the Egyptian religions at the beginnings, right? We don't know the evolution of all sorts of religions. But you have to imagine that Ra would have been one of the first conceptualized gods, having been as important as it was in the Egyptian pantheon. So for one of the foundational stories about that god to be that he was secretive about his name as not to relinquish power over himself means that this idea in human storytelling might be one of the oldest. Certainly we have to believe that it precedes written texts, that these ideas come before we have the ability to read them today. So, very interesting, and we get it replaying here in the Willows, which for all intents and purposes is a couple of guys that are reverting to prior religions as they lose civilization. Very, very interesting from that standpoint, if you ask me. The next thing I want to talk about is I want to go back to that previous... So we're going to the... we're going to the writer's corner portion of things. And I actually think I missed one of the... Yeah, I missed one of them. So I'll have to remember to talk about that. But when common... So we're going back to that former quote. When common objects in this way become charged with the suggestion of horror, they stimulate the imagination far more than things of unusual appearance. And these bushes, crowding, huddled about us, assumed for me in that darkness a bizarre grotesquerie of appearance that lent to them somehow the aspect of purposeful and living creatures. Their very ordinariness, I felt, masked what was malignant and hostile to us. This is priming the audience. This is something that I think is useful to writers if you can pull it off. I think that it is pulled off here. I think it's done quite well here. And the idea, look, this is certainly telling, not showing. But that goes back to, it serves a purpose, right? You are clarifying things for your reader here. But the idea of telling, not showing, being violated is, or being adhered to. You're supposed to show, not tell. This is telling, not showing. The idea here, though, is that this is breaking a rule, one of the foundational rules of what is known as good writing. And I've always been a fan of the phrase that you can read, well, I guess it's not a phrase, it's just sort of a principle. You read some of these greats, right? And they break all sorts of the good writing rules. And it always goes back to the idea that you can't do that unless you can. Here we have Algernon Blackwood can and is telling us, but he is telling us in a way that is priming us for not only the horror that has been, right? He's already been through the horror with the Bushes, not the presidents. He's already been through the horror with the Willows and the plants after nightfall taking on their own sort of apparitional being. And recontextualizing it with this quote. But then what you're doing is telling your reader, no, yeah, that's what you saw there. That was all of this going on, the suggestion of horror, ... But then you're setting them up to do it, to see it again. And I think that can be useful. Here is a question here, because we're getting close to the end, and this is a writer's corner question, because it has to do with point of view. Does the first-person narrator remove the suspense from horror? Does the first-person narrator remove the suspense from this text? Because this is presented as storytelling. This is presented as storytelling by our narrator. This is not presented as a found text. This is not third person where we are getting the story from someplace else. This is first person. Why do I ask, does first person's narration remove the suspense here? Well, because it implies very heavily that the speaker survives, right? So the speaker is, and not only survives, I think the bigger question in this text is whether or not the speaker would have maintained his sanity. And we know, because we're getting this story from him, he does. Would third person have been a better selection for this story, because it would remove the impetus for your reader, or it would remove if you told this story in third person, the possibility would stand that the narrator A does not survive or B does not survive with his sanity intact. We know that he must, because we're getting this story from him. Then I have just a really good quote here that I think is a bit of good writing. I can't disguise us any longer, I said. I don't like this place, and the darkness, and the noises, and the awful feelings I get. There's something here that beats me utterly. I'm in a blue funk, and that's the plain truth. If the other shore was different, I swear I'd be inclined to swim for it. The Swede turned very white beneath the deep tan of sun and wind. He stared straight at me and answered quietly, but his voice betrayed his huge excitement by its unnatural calmness. For the moment, at any rate, he was the strong man of the two. He was more phlegmatic, for one thing. "It's not a physical condition we can escape by running away," he replied in a tone of a doctor diagnosing some grave disease. "We must sit tight and wait. There are forces close here that could kill a herd of elephants in a second as easily as you or I could squash a fly. Our only chance is to keep perfectly still. Our insignificance, perhaps, may save us." I put a dozen questions into my expression of face, but found no words. It was precisely like listening to an accurate description of a disease whose symptoms had puzzled me. I mean that so far, although aware of our disturbing presence, they have not found us, not located us, as the Americans say, he went on. "They're blundering about like men hunting for a leak of gas. The puddle and canoe and provisions prove that. I think they feel us, but cannot actually see us. We must keep our minds quiet. It's our minds they feel. We must control our thoughts, or it's all up with us. Don't think about a pink elephant." What are you doing? You're thinking about a pink elephant. The very implication that we should not think about these things makes us focus on these things, from which the danger rises. I think that this is good writing. It is something that puts us in the place with the speaker, because I think it's an interesting choice that all of a sudden the Swede is an expert on whatever these things are, right? Because he's never experienced these things before, not that we know of. Which leads us to wonder why he has come to these conclusions. What is the journey on which he finds himself? We have the journey from our speaker who has struggled through the night. The speaker really has not. So what weird stuff is happening, or the Swede has not. So what weird stuff is happening to the Swede while our speaker is sleeping and napping during the day? We have these two in close quarters, but seemingly different worlds. And that is something that has taken this story to the next level. That is all I have for this video. If you like or appreciate what it is that I do here, hitting the like button really does help me out, as it tells YouTube to share this video with other literature lovers if you find yourself here by chance but not design. Literature is the only thing I talk about on this channel, dropping multiple videos every single week. And as always, I hope to have you back for the next one.